When I feel down, I feel down, gonna run to you. Whenever I feel down, when I feel down, I feel down, gonna run to you. Oh.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Village Podcast. My name is Connie Jakab, and I'm going to be your host. You know, I wanted to start this first episode with just giving a little bit of a foundation as to why I have felt very compelled to start this podcast. And the reason why a podcast is because in my conversations with parents and educators, one of the things that I keep hearing is we need help. Our kids are in trouble. Many educators have told me that they are burned out. They had a 10-year plan to retire, and that has now changed to 2-year plan to retire. And if they could, even right now, parents are exhausted. And when I thought about doing a webinar or thought about doing seminars, or I thought about bringing people to another something, it just seemed to overwhelm. And I thought, well, a podcast is a great way to bring us together in a way that you could go for a walk, you could listen on your drive, you could listen on a lunch break, make it accessible. I want to just start by saying that I want this to be a conversation. I don't want this just to be me talking. In fact, I'm going to have guests. And if you're an educator, a principal, an EA, a parent with a story, I would love to have you on my podcast. This is meant to be for the community. Village was actually created a couple of years ago with my friend Shelby, who now is probably got her master's in psychology. And we just started because we realized that in order for kids' lives to change, we really need to impact the people who hold them. And that's where Village came from. So it's a cause. It's me calling the village back. Our kids need the village more than ever. And yet there seems to be a lot of disconnect between mental health supports, parents, educators, and yet we all need to get on the same team. And so this conversation, there is a Facebook group where I'm going to be posting all of these podcasts, whether you're watching on YouTube, whether you're listening on Anchor, on Spotify or Apple. I want to be able to have a conversation where you can converse and open up that conversation. I also want to make these short. I don't want them to be long. I don't want them to be time consuming. And so 15 minutes is my goal because I want you to be able to fit this into your day. And yet right now, the conversation around our children's mental health has never been more important. I want to give you a little background on me, just so that you know who is this woman who has started this podcast. My name is Connie, and I've been working in mental health and resilience for over 20 years. I started my youth at risk work back in East Vancouver, working with drug dealers, gang members, students on the fringes of society who most people would want to forget about. Those were the kids that I cared about the most. And yet, because I was so new in my career, I didn't know how to reach them. Interestingly enough, I was learning hip hop dance as a hobby while I had started my career. And I started teaching these youth my hip hop moves, and it connected really well. And from there evolved into work around how do we create circles in hip hop and teach mental health and resilience to kids on the fringe. It was a very rewarding yet interesting journey. From there, I moved my mental health work into public schools. And from there, I was in middle class schools. I was in affluent schools. I was in lower income schools. And what I found very interesting was that all three demographics, these kids were suffering. And from say 1997 to where we are presently, which is when I started my work, to now, I've really noticed that there has definitely been an increase in anxiety. And over the last 2 years in the pandemic, it has only gotten worse. And I've always cared about this. And if you care about this, this podcast is for you. This conversation is for you. I have some solutions up my sleeve, but I also want to hear yours as well. In my work, I would bring kids closer and in circles and teach them about resilience. But for me, the greatest learning that I ever had was when my own son struggled with anxiety, depression. He was diagnosed with anxiety, depression, ADHD, oppositional defiance disorder at age 6, and also on the spectrum. At age 8, he became suicidal, and I actually had to take him to the hospital. And this is where I learned more about mental health in the hearts of our young people and what parents go through, what the parents were going through, the ones that I would try to work with. I didn't get where they were coming from, but now being a parent of a child in that exact place, well, I started to understand a little bit more about what crisis looks like, how it wreaks havoc on a home, how knocking on mental health door after mental health door, trying to find psychologists, being referred to pediatricians, being on waiting lists, having to have a literal crisis of attempting suicide to actually get the help we need. I saw how cracked our mental health system was, not to mention education. My son has never fit in to school. I think out of the 10 years he's been in school, he's liked 2 years of school. He's just never fit. And how many times have I been labeled the rogue mother by principals? In how many different schools have we tried? Because I would always just be doing anything I possibly could in order to make sure my son succeeded. This year, I stood in front of 300 teachers at our Edmonton Teachers Convention and our Calgary Teachers Convention. 300 teachers who represented those who said, we care about kids like yours, kids on the fringes, kids falling through the cracks, but we realize that we do not know how to reach these kids. And that is what this podcast is about. How do we reach the kids on the fringe? How do we reach the kids falling through the cracks? How do we bring them closer? How do we spark innovation in education that is greatly needed in order to make sure that these kids make it? How do we help parents who are just trying to survive, raise kids that are special and unique and need a different approach than maybe some of the typical parenting books that you read? If that's you, if you are that parent, if you are that educator who has a child like that in your classroom, in your home, and you need tools and skills, but more than that, you want to provide them with a village, then this is the podcast for you. I want to bring real life practical skills and strategies, but I also want to bring us together. Right now, we are fragmented. Our mental health care system is fragmented. Our education system is fragmented. They don't talk to each other. Parents tend to be a bit of a thorn in the flesh for some educators because they refuse to admit that their child has a problem. And, or in my case, we're moving and shaking on behalf of our kids in ways that the education system maybe isn't ready for. And for some parents, educators aren't listening. And what we need to do is we need to put our kids back in the center of our conversations and remember that their mental health, their success, them rising up is our priority. And I will remove every ounce of red tape to reach them. I will remove all my own systems and barriers and maybe even break some rules and get a little rebellious in order to reach them. Now, I just want to preface by saying that I am not against any system. I believe the mental health care system is doing the best they can with what they have. They are overloaded. Educators, I haven't met one that doesn't care. They just might not know how. And they have to work within a scope of practice that keeps them in a box. And I don't know one parent that wakes up not wanting their child to make it. They just don't know how. All of us are feeling the same thing from our own perspectives and our own scopes of practice. And it's time for us to come together and have authentic conversations, real conversations, so that we can have empathy for one another. We can join hands and be the village for our kids. And so I invite you to come along this journey with me. I would love to hear your thoughts. My question for you that I would love for you to comment on: is, what are you seeing in your world, in your classroom, in your home, in our world right now? What are you seeing from your perspective that is our greatest need and the reason why we need a village? And I will see you next week.
When I feel that, I